A gute Woche. The Rabbi Zugel started the Farbrengen by mentioning that this Shabbos has in it two things. First of all, it's a Shabbos which we read the Parsha of Tisa, and it's also the Shabbos Parsha Porah, where we read the special Parsha of Porah. And these two ideas, in other words, the idea that we read Parsha Kisisa is something which is part of the normal routine, that every Shabbos we read one of the Parshas of the Torah, and this Shabbos it comes out to be Parsha Kisisa. The idea that we read Parsha Porah is something special amongst the Arba Parshas that we read during this time of the year, and this is something special that happens once a year, which is similar to the idea that we find that there's two things in Avedas Hashem. There's what we call Tmidim Kesidram Umusafim Kihilchasan. In other words, there's the carbon Tamid, the carbon that they were makriv every single day in the Beis Hamikdash, which was called the carbon Tamid. So although every single day was a special carbon, a particular carbon, but nevertheless it was similar. Each day was the same carbon, the carbon Tamid Shel Shachar, and the carbon Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim. However, when it came special days, Shabbos, Rish Chodesh, or Yontif, then they were makriv a carbon Musaf. So in other words, there's two parts of Avedas Hashem. There's the part of Avedas Hashem, which is the Tmidim Kesidram, which a Jew has to do constantly, every single day. And in the same way, there's another part in Avedas Hashem where there's specialties, that a Jew comes and he reveals a certain part of his neshama in special occasions, which is symbolized by the idea of Musafim Kihil Chosam. And although the name of it is Musafim, which immediately tells us that it's only an addition to the Tamid. In other words, it's only an addition to the normal Aveda, but nevertheless, since Torah tells us to bring a Musaf, so obviously this is something which is extremely important, and is something which is necessary in Avedas Hashem. Now, as far as Shabbos Parshas Porah is concerned, we learn, the Alter Rebbe tells us in Likutei Torah, that what is the teaching of Shabbos Parshas Porah? What is the teaching of the Porah Aduma? In the Porah Aduma we find two contrasting things. On one hand, what they did was that they took the Porah Aduma and they burned it completely until it was completely ashes. And then they would put Mayim Chayim El Keli, they would put the water into a Keli, and then they would put the ashes into it. So in other words, the Tara of the Porah Aduma was both through the ashes and through the water. Now the idea of ashes obviously comes from fire, so it's fire and water being involved in this Aveda. Now the basic difference between fire and water is similar to the difference, as it's called in Chassidus, the Aveda of Rotzi and the Aveda of Shuv. Now what is the difference between Aveda of Rotzi and the Aveda of Shuv? Rotzi means when a Jew has a Rotzi to Hashem, which means he goes out to Hashem and he's trying to reach, to ascend to Elikus, and so to speak, to leave the mundane, to leave the materialistic world, and to become closer to Hashem. The idea of Shuv symbolizes the idea where a person remains in this material world, in this body, and he deals with it and he copes with it, that everything should coincide with Torah mitzvahs, which is basically the difference, obviously, between the neshama and the guf. The neshama is the part that's achelik alikam mimal mamish. It's a part of Hashem that the neshama constantly strives to reunite with its creator, with the Eibishter, which it's a very part of. It's the essence of Elikus. The guf, on the other hand, is offer min ha'adama, was created from the earth. It's part of this world. It's part of the materialistic world, and it clings to this world. And that is the two Avedas, which is also symbolized in Eishumayim. The difference between water and fire is, water by very nature always descends to the lowest place. And the only place it will settle is only if it finds the lowest point. Fire, on the other hand, constantly is going upwards. And the only way the fire remains in this world is by having something that the fire holds onto, the wick of a candle, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, or for that matter, anything that the fire is in, and that's actually holding the fire down. But if not for the fact that you're holding the fire down, the fire by its very nature would want to reunite with its source. The Yesed Ha'esh HaKlali, the general Yesed Ha'esh, the source of fire, which, as the Alter Rebbe mentions in Tanya, is Tachas Galgal Yarech, is under the moon. Now, what is the teaching of Parah Adumah? That we have over here both the idea of fire, the idea of ashes, and the idea of water. That a Jew has to combine both Avedas, both the Aveda of Rotzi and the Aveda of Shuv. In other words, both the Aveda of trying to ascend and trying to leave the material, the mundane. And on the other hand, bringing down godliness, alikus, into this world is the Aveda of Shuv. And making it into an Aveda Achas, into one singular Aveda, which is also symbolized, we find that Yom Kippur is called Achas Bashana, once a year. Which Chassidus explains, that's the idea that Achas Bashana, you reveal the Achas of the Neshama. Just like on Yom Kippur itself, the Kehin Gadol, which was the special Neshama of Klal Yisrael, went into the Kedesh HaKadoshim. In the same way, every single Jew reveals that special part of him, the Achas, which is in his Nefesh. In the same way, when it comes to a special Aveda, which only comes certain times during the year, that part of that, the Aveda, we reveal that part of the Nefesh, which is the Achas in the Nefesh, and that Aveda is an Aveda which is not only for that particular time of the year. In other words, when it comes, for example, the Shabbos Parshas Parah, when we read the Parsha of Parah Adumah, so then this Aveda is appropriate. But rather, this one time a year is supposed to stay with us throughout the entire year, until the following year, when we will again read the Parshas Parah, and we will again have this inspiration to have this type of Aveda throughout the entire year. Which obviously, this idea of Ratzi V'Shuv also coincides with the idea of Tmidim Kesidram, Musafim Kihilchasam. The idea of Tmidim Kesidram is the normal Aveda, the daily routine, which is symbolized by the concept of Shuv. On the other hand, the Aveda of Musafim Kihilchasam, the special Aveda, is symbolized by the concept of Ratzi, where a Jew leaves the routine and he goes to higher and greater, into greater heights. The Parshas HaShavua, which is the Parsha of Tisa, also has a special teaching, which teaches us that we started off Kisisa es Reish B'nai Yisrael, which the literal translation is when you will raise the heads of Jews, which means, in other words, the basic difference between a person and an animal, a chay and a medaber, is that in a medaber, the head stands higher than the rest of the body. By an animal, the head and the rest of the body are on the same level, on the same plane, which shows that the head is not in control of the body, it's all on one level. Masha'enkin, when we're dealing with a Jew, dealing with a person, especially a Jew, so the head is begashmis, higher than the body, which symbolizes the idea that the head is in control of the rest of the body, which is also this idea that, and that's basically the head is higher than the rest of the body. When it comes to the Parsha of Kisisa, what does Kisisa tell us? That a person is supposed to raise even his head. In other words, although by nature the head is higher than the body, but the person is supposed to raise the head. In other words, also symbolized by the idea of Musaf and Kil Chosam, there is the Tmidim Kisidram, the normal Seder Aveda, the normal Aveda, which the head is also higher than the body. And that's the Aveda of Tmidim. But there are those auspicious times and those special times where a Jew could reach even greater heights. The idea of bringing a carbon musaf, an addition to his Aveda. And this addition to his Aveda is symbolized by the idea of raising the head even higher than it is by its natural state. And this is especially emphasized when we're standing here in the Chedesh Adar, which Chedesh Adar especially is the idea of Simcha, where a Jew, the idea of Simcha is an Aveda which is for Kol HaShana. Throughout the entire year, a person is supposed to be b'Simcha. As the idea is that in Chedesh Adar is Marb b'Simcha. There's an additional Simcha. Also again symbolizing the idea of Musaf and Kil Chosam, besides the simcha, which is supposed to be tmidam kisidram, the normal concept of simcha, a Jew is expected to have the musafim kilchasam, the extra simcha which comes in Chedesh Adar. And in Chedesh Adar itself, it's not just another edition of simcha, but rather a simcha which is far beyond, greater than the simcha of the entire year, until it is symbolized. And the peak of the simcha is on Purim, where it's Adal Yoda, where a Jew reaches the simcha of Adal Yoda, which means higher than the concept of Seichel, which is the epitome of simcha. And a Jew goes on from the simcha of Purim to even greater heights throughout the entire year, because again, the idea of Purim is not only something that's supposed to happen once a year, but rather Purim and the joy of Purim is supposed to permeate the simcha throughout the entire year. And through the simcha of Purim, that we have the additional simcha, we are able to have chayis in our Aveda, in Musafim Kihilchasam, in the additional simcha, together remaining with the Tmidim Kisidram, not forgetting about the normal Aveda that we have throughout the entire year. And through that, we'll eventually come to Mismach Geula LeGeula, that from the Geula of Purim, we come to the Geula of Pesach, and especially to the Geula HaMitis V'Ashleima B'Karev Mamsh. Bringing this out, this idea of Ratzi V'Shuv and practicality, the Rebbe brought it out later on in the Farbrengen, explaining that especially now, there's the time, right after Purim is the time that you start thinking about Mois Chitim. As the Rebbe spoke about the idea of Mois Chitim. There's two ways a person should go about the Aveda of Mois Chitim. There could be a person that goes in Mois Chitim and he thinks to himself that he'll stay in his house, he'll remain in his place, and if the Gabbai of the Mois Chitim wants Mois Chitim, he'll come to his house, and he'll give to him whatever the Gabbai feels that he should give him, and he'll give it to him b'sever ponim yofis. In other words, he'll with a happiness and with a happy face, showing that he's not upset by the idea that he's giving away the money for tzedakah. But on the other hand, he's not going to be going and looking where he could do something for Mois Chitim, which is the idea of Ratzui. In other words, Ratzui also miloshen ritza, that he's running around and he's not in a state of, so to speak, a peace of mind and sitting at home and content with himself and happy with the situation. That's the idea of Ratzui. The person looking to do a mitzvah. And even after he did the mitzvah, there's still necessary the idea of shuv. The idea of shuv is also the idea of reevaluating, reassessing the situation, and seeing whether or not the person, even if the person is totally involved in going around and trying to do mitzvahs, and he's not sitting passively at home and happy with his situation, but he's constantly in a situation of ratzi. But once in a while, it's necessary for the person, so to speak, to get back to himself and to assess his own situation and see if everything with his own situation is also in its proper state of form. That although he's constantly involved, and he's overly involved in trying to do mitzvahs and trying to do Teiras Avedas Hashem, but nevertheless, he needs to assess himself and to evaluate and see where he actually stands in his observance of Teirah mitzvahs and how he's fulfilling everything that he's supposed to fulfill. In the same way that Rebbe brought out this concept of Ratzi V'Shuv, that the idea of Ratzi V'Shuv is we find a person, for example, can imagine himself, and a person can sit down and imagine how he will be in the state when Mashiach will come. Well, obviously in that state, that is the greatest possible situation where he may find himself. And he will, so to speak, get himself internally involved in this situation, and he will look at himself as a neshama, which is completely, so to speak, not involved in the guf, as it will be when Mashiach will come, when the guf will not be a hindrance to his Avedas Hashem, and he'll, so to speak, go into a kleis hanefesh. His neshama will go out for a likus. But on the other hand, there's also an Avedas Hashem which he has to do with the guf. And there's the part of the world that he is supposed to elevate. So on that he could think to himself, just like we find the idea of Yisachar and Zvulun, that Yisachar was paid by Zvulun, and they were given money in order to sustain themselves. And through that, Zvulun also had a part in Yisachar's Teda. This person could also think that he will stand in a constant Ratzui. He will be constantly involved in the Kleis HaNefesh to the Eibishter. And as far as Avedas Habirurim is concerned, in other words, dealing with this world, that's something that he will leave for somebody else. Maybe he will give something to someone else in order for the person to be involved in it. So he should also have a certain chelik in the mitzvah. But that he should be personally involved in this Ratzi, that he won't be. On that, the limud of Parah Adumah is that just like by Parah Adumah we find that on one hand there had to be a fire. And not just a regular fire. There were other fires that were connected with other korbanos as well. But the Parah Adumah had to be entirely burnt. So obviously to burn an entire Parah Adumah, you had to have a big fire. Which also symbolizes the idea that there's the Aveda min Hakala Lakovit, which means from easier to harder. You're going from one level to another level. You keep ascending in levels in your commitment to Elikut, to Yiddishkeit. There is the Aveda, the very simple Aveda of trying to be worried about Amalek. Amalek is the concept of Asher Korcha Baderech, that it makes you cold until it makes you frozen. That a person is so frozen that he's completely uninvolved in Avedas Hashem. That is one level of Aveda, which obviously is also an important level in Aveda, but it's not Tachlis or Aveda. Then there's a way of making a fire. But if a person breaks himself up into pieces, when you take a big piece of wood and you want a fire to burn it, you need a large fire, a big fire to burn a big piece of wood. If you have small pieces of wood, splinters of wood, so the splinters of wood can catch fire even from a small fire. And then there's the Tachlis or Aveda, the fire that would take to burn a Parah Adumah, which is a large fire. And that large fire is necessary, symbolizes the Aveda of Ratzi, and the epitome of the Aveda of Ratzi of a Jew. But nevertheless, although the person stands in this Aveda of Ratzi, he still needs the Aveda of Shuv, which is the Aveda of assessing himself, and coming down into this world and dealing with the simple factors of this world, which is symbolized also by the idea of Tmidam Kesidram, the normal day-to-day Aveda that a person has in Gashmi Yisraelam, that to do the Aveda in Gashmi Yisraelam, and only through these two Avedas together, a person could truly perform, be Mekayim, the mitzvah of Parah Adumah. This is also brought out by the idea that we first start with Kisisa. The idea of Kisisa is you raise the Jews, you raise even the head of a Jew, until eventually you come to Vayakil, which Vayakil Moshe is. Moshe formed Kehilas B'Shabbos, which also symbolizes the idea that La'asid Lavi, when Mashiach will come, so the Jews will be one Kehila, all the Jews together, the Eibishter will be the Vayakil, and he will make Jews all one Kehila. But on the other hand, when Jews are one Kehila, a Jew could think that then he will lose his individuality. In other words, since he'll be part of the entire Kehila of Jews, so there will no longer be the importance of each particular Jew. So on that comes the next parsha, the parsha of Pikudei, which shows, Pikudei is the idea of counting, that every single Jew separately is counted, every single Jew counts, and this year Vayakil and Pikudei are together, which shows that although, and the togetherness is in the idea, in some Kehilas they have, that you read Vayakil and Pikudei, but Vayakil and Pikudei is never one aliyah. In other words, the aliyah finishes by the end of Vayakil, and by the beginning of Pikudei it starts another aliyah. But the minig, the widespread minig is, and minig Chabad, is that Vayakil and Pikudei is all in one aliyah, which shows that it works together, that although there's the idea of Vayakil, which symbolizes the idea that all Jews are together, but on the other hand there's the Pikudei, which shows that every single Jew is counted, that every single Jew has his individuality, which is also the concept of Ratzi V'Shuv. Mitzad the Aveda of Ratzui, all the Jews are connected to Hashem. So the idea, the emphasis on the individuality is not so strong, is not so stressed, because the Jews are united with Hashem. The Shuv, when a Jew comes down to his own Aveda, and he comes down again to this world, so to speak, in the mundane world, and he gets involved in his personal conflict with the Yetzer Hara and with involvement of dealing with his part of the world that he has to elevate. So over here, the concept of individuality is brought out, and there's another special importance of Pekudei the Rebbe brought out today, that we find that Davar Shebeminyan or Davar Kavua is Eini Bottle, and through the fact that every Jew is counted, so every Jew gets in itself a special chshivus, and he doesn't become bottle, he doesn't lose his importance, until we eventually come to Vayikra El Mesha, that the Eibishter calls to Mesha, which there's the part of Mesha in every single Jew. The Mesha in every Jew, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that the Gemara says that the Pasuk tells us, Va'ata Yisrael Mo Hashem Alikecha Sheil Mi'imach Kiyim Liyira. That what is the Eibishter asking from you? Merely that every person should have fear of Hashem. So the Gemara asks, Atu Yira Milsa Zutrasehi? Is then Yira something which is so trivial, something so small, so meaningless, so simple that a person, that the Eibishter can actually express himself by saying Mo Havaya Lekecha Sheil Mi'imach? So the Gemara answers in Legabi Meisha Milsha Zutrasi. As far as Meisha is concerned, it's something very simple. So the basic question on it is fine, Legabi Meisha Milsha Zutrasi, but how is it asked from every Jew? And the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya that every single Jew has within him the Meisha Shebekirbe, the part of Meisha which is in him, which is the very inner part of the Jew. So the Eibishter calls to the Meisha, which is in every Jew. And this calling brings out that it says, as the Pasuk continues, and it speaks about the Aved of Korbanos, that Adam ki yakriv mikem korban Hashem, that every Jew is expected to bring a korban, to bring an offering to Hashem. And as the Alter Rebbe explains in Likutei Torah, that it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban Hashem, which means that a korban has to be brought mikem, that every Jew has to be makriv his own little korban, made out of his own nefesh habamis, out of his own guf, to sacrifice it to Hashem. And there are different types of nefesh habamis by a Jew. There's min habakar and min hatzain, various different types of a nefesh habamis by a Jew. And through the aveda of korbanos of every Jew, we will eventually come that from Parsha Parah, we go to Parshas Achedesh, which Achedesh is Achedesh Hazel Lochem, Reish Chodoshim, Rishon Hu Lachem, L'Chochi Hashanah. This is the first month. And the Gemara says there are three things that are called Rishon. And one of them is the Beis HaMikdash, that we will Zeicha, very speedily, that we will come to Achedesh Hazel Lachem, Rishon Hu Lachem, L'Chochi Hashanah. That the Rishon, in other words, that we will come to this Rishon, which is the Beis HaMikdash, straight from Parshas Parah, and as the Rebbe expressed himself, that we don't even have to wait till Mitzvah Shabbos. That right away we will have the Geula Hamitis V'Ashlema, and there will be V'Hikitzu V'Rannu Sheikh Niyofer, that all those people that are ready are Sheikh Niyofer. They will get up, Unisidireinu Birishenu, that he will get up, there will be the Tchias HaMesim, and we will go to the Geula, and we will have the Kiddush HaChedesh, the Kiddush of Rish Chedesh Nisan, as it is, the Kiddush Al Pi Bezdin, that Bezdin will actually be Mekadesh the Rish Chedesh. B'Geula ha'amitis v'ashlema. A gute Woche.